Hello everyone, my name is Manish Kudale and I am currently pursuing my Masters in Sustainable Development Practice at Terry School of Advanced Studies. Welcome to this walkthrough of the Global Climate Finance Dashboard. The data for this dashboard comes from the Global Landscape of Climate Finance 2025 report published by the Climate Policy Initiative. At the top of the dashboard, we see the key performance indicators. In 2023, climate finance hit $1.9 trillion, an all-time high, but still far short of the $6 to 9 trillion needed annually by 2030. The nearly 13,000 transactions shows that the flows are spread across thousands of deals, not just a few mega projects. With an average deal size of $150 million, the picture is dominated by large infrastructure while smaller community projects remain underrepresented. On the left side, there is a filter for destination groups. It allows us to view climate finance flow categories such as advanced economies, China, other emerging and developing economies, least developed countries, transregionals, and unknown. This filter changes the entire dashboard to reflect the flows specific to chosen group. Finance source show the geographic origin of capital, who the money comes from by broad country groups. The bar lengths indicate each group's share of total source finance. Next, we have a donut chart showing the instrument used to channel climate finance. The categories include project level market rate debt, balance sheet equity, project level equity, grants, and etc. The stacked bar chart here shows the use of finances divided into three categories: mitigation, adaptation, and dual benefits. The tree map organizes finance into the sectors. Each block represents a sector, and the size of the block corresponds to its share of the total flows. The sector includes energy system, transport, building and infrastructure, agriculture, forestry, land use and fisheries, water and wastewater, waste industry, information communication technology, and other cross-sectoral activities. The bar chart separates finance contribution into public service and private sources. Public sources include governments, national and multinational development financial institutions, state-owned entities, and climate funds. Private sources include commercial financial institutions, corporations, households, or individuals. Finally, the dashboard has a donut chart breaking down flows into domestic finance and international finance. Domestic refers to the capital raised and used within the same country, while the international refers to the cross-border flows, often from developed countries to emerging or developing economies. So overall, the dashboard is structured to answer three big questions. Where does climate finance go? How is it financed? And what purpose and sectors it supports? Let's dwell into the details. Looking at the bars for the China and advanced economy, together they mobilize about $1.5 trillion in 2023. That's nearly 80% of all global climate finance flows. This concentration shows that while these regions are leading in transition, thanks to the large domestic markets, strong policies, and access to the capital. It also highlights a major imbalance. The rest of the world, including many vulnerable developing regions, is left to share just 20% of the global flows, even though their climate finance needs are often far greater. Flows to the least developed countries are only about $43 billion in 2023. That's barely 2% of the global climate finance. These LDCs are most climate vulnerable, facing mountain risk from the floods, droughts, and heat waves. These flows fall dramatically short of their needs. Without more grants and low-cost finance, many of the most important adaptation and resilience projects in these countries simply won't happen. This gap is central to the debate leading to the COP30 in Brazil. Developing countries argue under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that wealthier nations who historically emitted the most must step up and provide much larger volumes of the international, concessional, and grant-based finance. In 2023, private finance passed the $1 trillion mark for the first time. That means the majority of the climate finance now comes from household, companies, and financial institutions. Household and individuals invested around $470 billion. The bulk of this came from the buying electric vehicles and energy efficient technologies for homes, such as efficient appliances, heat pumps, rooftop solar. Commercial financial institutions like commercial bank asset managers mobilize about $436 billion. This role is mostly through the loans, project finance, and bond purchases. This investment go into the large renewable energy projects, green transport systems, and energy efficient projects, buildings, and industries. Corporation invested around $335 billion. This includes direct spending on renewable energy plants, supply chain decarbonization, R&D into the clean technology, industry efficiency projects, etc. In 2023, public sources contributed just under $700 billion. Unlike private flows, which are concentrated in consumer and corporate markets, public finance is designed to fill gaps, de-risk projects, and transfer capital internationally, especially to the developing countries. Government provided around $133 billion, mainly through budget reallocations, subsidies, and other direct spending on public infrastructure. National Development Finance institutions invested around $140 billion. These banks plays a catalytic role, often co-financing with private investors to bring down risk and crowd in capital. Multilateral development financial institutions such as World Bank or regional development banks mobilize around $119 billion. Their strength lies in large concessional loans, guarantees, and technical assistance across multiple regions. State-owned financial institutions and state-owned enterprises together accounted for nearly $200 billion. Much of this went into the energy transition, grid modernizations, transport electrification within their own countries. Multilateral climate funds like the Green Climate Funds contributed around $3 billion. While small in scale compared to the banks, these flows are critical because they are grant-based or highly concessional, targeting projects that would otherwise not attract funding. Finally, bilateral development financial institutions and export credit agencies add another smaller slice, providing targeted, concessional or trade-related support. In financial instruments, project-level market rate debt is the largest instrument, about $817 billion in 2023. It represents loans given at the commercial terms directly to the projects like solar plants, wind farms, or grid upgrades. This is how most large-scale renewable energy projects are financed. Balance sheet equity was about $580 billion. This reflects companies or utilities investing their own capital into the climate projects. For example, when a corporation funds new renewable energy plants or efficiency improvements directly from its balance sheet. Balance sheet debt reached $231 billion. This represents companies taking on debt themselves, like corporate loans or bonds, to fund climate-related investments. Project level equity was $146 billion. This is when investors, including private equity funds or strategic partners, take ownership stakes in specific climate projects. It's common in renewable energy and infrastructure development projects. Low-cost project debt accounted for about $68 billion. Unlike market rate loans, this is concessional lending, often provided by the development banks or climate funds. It helps make projects viable in regions where commercial rates would get expensive. Grants contributed to $57 billion. This is most important source for finance for the developing countries. These are non-repayable funds, often used for adaptation projects, technical assistance, or early-stage pilot initiatives that can't attract private investment yet. This chart shows that the 90% of the global climate finance comes through the commercial debt and equity, while grants and concessional loans remain very limited. Yet those concessional instruments are crucial for making projects possible in developing countries where risks are higher. Now we'll look at the mitigation versus adaptation finance. Mitigation refers to the actions that reduces or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, it's about tackling the root cause of climate change by cutting emissions or increasing the systems that absorb carbon, like forests. In 2023, mitigation finance reached $1.78 trillion, more than double of $757 billion tracked in 2018. This growth was driven mainly by the private investment in renewable energy, transport, electrification, and energy efficient buildings. If you look at the sectors, then energy systems, which is having $831 billion, is the largest sector, accounting for almost half of the mitigation finance. This growth is led by the solar PV, onshore wind, and battery storage. Transport is the fastest growing sector with $539 billion, driven by the electrical vehicles from passenger cars to the 2 to 3 wheelers in emerging markets. Public transport decarbonization is also gaining attention. Building and infrastructure with $290 billion focused heavily on the energy efficiency. Investment includes heat pumps, efficient appliances, rooftop solar water heaters, and the insulation upgrades. Agriculture, forests, land use, and fisheries also constitutes $38 billion. This is very small in volume, but one of the most fastest growing areas. The key driver includes agrivoltaics, agroforestry, sustainable fisheries, and reforestation. Voluntary carbon markets are starting to support the AFOLU projects, but finance is still far below the needs. Industry also constitutes $26 billion, but this remains stagnant. Finance mostly for the energy efficient upgrades. Biggest gaps lies in the decarbonizing steel, cement, and chemicals, which needs massive capital and concessional support. In adaptation, in 2023, only $65 billion went to the adaptation. That's less than 4% of the total climate finance. By comparison, CPI estimates that emerging and developing economies alone will need $222 billion every year by 2030 just for adaptation. Around 91% of the tracked adaptation flows come from the public actors, governments, development banks, and climate funds. Private adaptation are poorly captured since many companies treat resilience spending as normal risk management or maintenance, not as a climate finance. The sectoral focus is mostly on the water management, disaster risk reduction, agriculture resilience, and infrastructure upgrades. Regional imbalances can be seen. LDCs and sub-Saharan Africa rely mostly on the adaptation support, but they receive the smallest share of the total finance. Dual benefit finance refers to the projects that simultaneously cut emission and build resilience to the climate impacts. In other words, they address both mitigation and adaptation goals at the same time. The examples are like restoring mangroves, investing in climate-smart agriculture, upgrading urban infrastructure projects. This dashboard gives us the story of the global climate finance. Flows are rising fast with nearly $1.9 trillion tracked in 2023, but they are highly concentrated. Most money stays in advanced economies and China, while emerging market and least developed countries are left with various small fractions. The bulk of finance goes to the mitigation, especially energy and transport, while adaptation remains underfunded, even though it is a matter of survival for vulnerable communities. Private finance now leads, especially through the households, corporations and banks. Yet concessional public finance, grants and low-cost loans remains critical to reach places where private capital flow does not follow. And finally, most finance is domestic, highlighting why international support, especially from richer countries, is central to demands of developing nations heading into the COP30. So the final words, the world is mobilizing more money than ever for the climate action, but the challenge is to make it bigger, fairer and better balanced, so that no country, sector or community is left behind. Thank you.